Let's get a word with Dan Hodges, from Dan Hodges, commentator, of course, journalist, Mail on Sunday, always has a big view on the big stories of the day. Dan, good afternoon to you.
Afternoon.
It's funny, isn't it? When you and I first started having kind of, debates and you joined me on radio shows, I can remember a particular moment, I don't know if you recall this, when we were sat in a studio elsewhere, and it was you and the current leader of UKIP at the time, and it was one of the most uncomfortable comfortable moments, I think, in broadcasting history from where I was sat, because neither of you had a word to say to each other, but it was a very dignified debate. I only raise that because it's interesting that now UKIP, who are of course still going, sort of, very much a backseat to what's happening with reform. Have you ever seen a party or any kind of star rise quite as quickly, love them or hate them, as Nigel Farage's Reform Party?
There are examples. I mean, I'm old enough to remember when the Greens suddenly came out of nowhere in the 1980s and had this incredible success in the local elections, and there was suddenly a sort of a green surge, and that faded away. Obviously, we had the SDP Liberal Alliance, and they were told to go back to their constituencies and prepare for government. But I think there is so we do have precedents. But I think you're right. I don't think you can underestimate just how significant the reform surge is. I mean, I think, to feed into what you were saying at the sort of the top of the programme, this debate about whether or not reform and the Tories are going to do a deal. Frankly, I'm going to be completely honest. I think at the moment, the more pressing question is, by the time we get to the next election, is there going to be a Tory party left for reform to do a deal with? The way things are going at the moment. And I know Tory MPs are becoming increasingly concerned about reform's direction of travel, their own direction of travel, and what's obviously, frankly, what they see as the lacklustre and ineffective leadership of Kemi Badenoch. And I think that's the key to it. I think the reality is there is not going to be any form of deal as long as Kemi Badenoch remains Tory leader. But obviously the question is, how long is she going to remain Tory leader? At the moment, I would not be, putting a lot of money, frankly, on her still being in post in 12 months' time. So I think that's one of the key things we're going to have to keep an eye on.
I mean, there's certain irredeemable realities, I suppose, though, Dan, isn't there? I mean, if you look at voting intention, I know reform had one of the more interesting parts of the last election was the areas where reform came second, and that was quite close, and I think that is a big factor in how they will fare in the next election, assuming they continue on this rise that they appear to be enjoying. But there are many more Labour seats that I can't imagine would turn anything like to reform should there be an election today or in 10 years' time. But if you look back to when Boris Johnson came into power, and we said, look, he's got a nice big majority, 80-odd seats, that's Boris Johnson in Downing Street for 2 terms at least. He's going to be there for 2 terms. Or there's only 2 things that could happen to scupper that. One would be there'd have to be some kind of scandal and he was almost forced out. And 2, you'd have to have, I don't know, something daft like the SNP collapses in Scotland. And good Lord, both of those things happen spectacularly.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of things. Firstly, the polls are overestimating reform support. Right. If you're asked at the moment, if you're in the street, you're online, the phone rings, you've got a polling company, a pollster says, how are you going to vote if there's an election tomorrow? You've got an electorate that obviously was hugely disillusioned with the Tories, was sick of them after 14 years, is obviously hugely disillusioned with Keir Starmer and Labour because of all the issues we've all talked about since they got into government. It is not surprising that a number of people are going to effectively use a pollster's question as a form of protest and say, I'm going to vote for, plague on both their houses. I'm going to vote for reform. We will see. Obviously, we've got local elections coming up. I expect reform to do very well in those local elections. But the reality is, when you get to a general election, you're electing a government. It's a completely different kettle of fish. I mean, there's an opinion poll out today that shows that despite all the disillusionment, Keir Starmer is 10 points ahead of Nigel Farage in the question, who do you think would make the best Prime Minister of the country? So you've got that. You've got the issues with the polling system. Remember, on polling day last year, we had an exit poll which was supposedly was going to give Reform 10, I think it was 10 seats. They ended up with 5 because of the way the polling system mitigates against them. Obviously, they don't have the same sort of infrastructure and traditional organisation that the main parties had. So you have to put in all these caveats. Because the main thing is we're still 3.5 years away from the next election. And obviously a lot can happen between then. But that all said, I think the one factor that is really different this time is, as I say, just it's not an implosion, it's the complete ongoing erosion of the Tory vote and the failure of the Tory party and Kemi Badenoch to really do anything significant to start to address all the massive strategic problems that they faced at the last general election. Yeah. I mean, there is one other factor, though. I think, the problem is this simplistic. If there is a Tory reform alliance, that will obviously be a way of saving the Tories and boosting reform. What people forget is there is a significant amount of reform vote which is actually disaffected Labour voters. So if Nigel Farage was seen to pivot towards the Tories, immediately there are a lot of people saying, hang on a second, that's not, and Labour would immediately pounce on that. Similarly, there are a lot of relatively sort of liberal Tory voters who did stick, held their noses and stuck with the Tories last time. If they see the Tories pivoting towards reform, they're going to say, no, that's too nuts for me, and just go off to the Lib Dems. So it's complicated, and this is actually why Kemi Badenoch has so many problems at the moment. She you can see it. It's why she frankly hasn't done anything since she became leader, because she doesn't know what to do. She doesn't know whether to pivot towards reform.
Correct.
Or the extent to which she should pivot towards reform, the extent to which she should sort of pivot to try and get voters back from the Lib Dems, or try and put forward a new sort of independent Tory agenda.
Let's move to this story, Dan. Who would have, I said this in the last hour, who would have thought in 2025 anybody would find themselves getting collared in the old WhatsApp roost? But here we are again. Matt Hancock's been there, some pretty unsavoury cops over there at Charing Cross Police Station found themselves in the same thing. I think there's been teachers and a few other characters. It seems to be the oldest one in the book these days, but that's exactly what's happened. Not one but 2 MPs. One has been fired as a minister, whip suspended. There's another one, Oliver Ryan, revealing he was a key member of this WhatsApp group. It was called Trigger Me Timbers, and it was really allegations of racism, sexism, anti-Semitism, homophobia that's done it here. Some pretty unsavoury stuff going on there. And this comes, of course, from the party, or certainly a couple of members of the party that would, on any other day of the week, would have claimed, oh, no, it's the horrible Tories, right-wingers that do stuff like this, not us nice socialists. Apparently not.
Well, I think, just to begin with, I mean, I do have issues with this scandal, because as a rule, I do think we are becoming a little bit too excessively puritanical in relation to how people conduct themselves in private, on private WhatsApp groups, the nature of discourse, which is not for public consumption, people joking and saying stupid things, which are sort of poor off-collar jokes, but are not what they sort of necessarily believe in. Yeah. So that's is normally my starting point on this sort of stuff. But the problem we have, and you just touched on it, firstly, there is the nature of some of this, which was racist, homophobic, and anti-Semitic, allegedly. This is something that Keir Starmer, firstly, said he was going to be cracking down on. But secondly, as you and your viewers are aware, whenever anybody from another political party or anywhere else on the political spectrum is caught doing this, telling an off-colour joke or something that could be construed as being racist or sexist or homophobic or Islamophobic, the Labour Party are the first to come down hard like a ton of bricks on people and say, drum them out of town. So there's that aspect. Plus, and this is not hindsight, I was saying this for years, even before Keir Starmer became Prime Minister. We had this whole holier than thou, pious, I'm going to clear up politics, we're going to be so much better. You know, people like Boris and the Tories, they've lowered the tone of politics. We are going to be completely different. And I was saying at the time, this is going to come back and bite you.
Yes.
Because you're not that different, and people are going to see you're not that different, and this is what we're seeing at the moment. So I do have some sympathy. I'll be honest.
I agree. I tend to agree with that, Dan. And it was the same really when Keir Starmer, suddenly found himself in about 40 grand's worth of Armani suits or whatever it was. It wasn't the fact, because nothing illegal happened there. If a donor wants to give some money to a party, he can do. But the mood music and everything that Labour stood for was that, we don't even know millionaires. We don't know people like that. That's the old Tories. They know all those characters. No, we're working people. We're working class people, and we only know working class people. All that higher echelon stuff. No. That's the old Conservative way. We are very different. And that's where the line is drawn on this, isn't it? It's that idea that the moral high ground that they spent so long attempting to occupy gets somewhat obliterated by stories like this. And it brings us on to the voice coaching story, which again, similar, I'm sure this is in similar territory. Number 10 refusing to reveal who paid for Starmer's voice coach. I mean, first question is, someone paid for that? Wow, there is that. But secondly, it's likely to be Lord Ali or somebody like that threw a few quid into the pot for this. And again, it's just that look, isn't it? You can imagine how much fun the Labour Party would have had if they discovered Boris Johnson had had speech lessons.
Well, we remember what the Labour Party was saying at the time. They were saying Boris Johnson should resign because he wasn't obeying the rules. Yeah. And I do think you're absolutely right. I think, but there's an element that this is just a bit sort of, it's WhatsApp messages, a little bit tittle tattle, a bit of Westminster froth. But I think it does come back to a more fundamental strategic problem that Labour have got at the moment, which is this. I don't think, if you speak to ministers, advisors, MPs, even they would admit, Labour MPs, Labour ministers, Labour advisors, even they would admit they didn't win the last election because the country was swept away by Keir Starmer and the party and the Labour Party and what their offer was. Yeah. They won the last election because people were sick of the Tories, and they were a little bit sceptical, but they wanted Labour. They wanted to give Labour the chance to show them that they could be different. Now, it's still early days. I understand Labour's inherited a lot of problems from the Tories, and this idea. Everything was wonderful until Keir Starmer came in and everything then fell apart. Is just rubbish. I think we've all got longer memories than that. But the point is, as I say, Labour won the last election because the British public were going to give them the chance to show them that they could be different and they could be better. And at the moment, every day we're getting another story which basically is demonstrated to the public that Labour aren't that different. And Labour aren't better. And that's the problem that Starmer's got. And that's why stories like this, whilst they may seem sort of part of the whole Westminster gossip mill, and we will move on from this in the next few days. That's the problem for Starmer. He said, vote for me, I'll be different. And the reality is at the moment he isn't.
Yeah. Spot on. Dan, thank you. Great to have you on. We will speak again soon, I hope. Dan Hodges, commentator, of course, journalist with the Mail on Sunday.